Gosh, that was a solid silence in the room, my goodness. So, yeah, thank you very much. And please, as soon as you take your seats, we'll get started. I feel like I'm on air hostess saying, you know, as soon as everybody's buckled up, we'll get airborne. Okay, my name is Nadia Hijab. I'm a co-founder of the US campaign, and now I serve on the advisory board. And I'm also a co-founder of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and I'm now serving as director. And I want to introduce our panel here tonight. Hatem Bazian is chairman of American Muslims for Palestine and co-founder and academic affairs chair at Zaytuna College. And that's actually the first Muslim liberal arts college in America. He's also a senior lecturer in the departments of Near East and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Phyllis Bennett is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's one of the co-founders of the US campaign, and she and I were actually among the co-founders. There's several in this room, and we're still talking even though we work very closely together. She works closely with the UN-based International Coordinating Network on Palestine. She's written a number of books, the most recent being the brand new third edition of Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict at Renner. And there are copies here, and she'll be very happy to sign them. I encourage you all to purchase them. They're at the registration table, and she's made a special price for the US campaign, as she always does. So I was asked by the US campaign's great membership coordinator, an outreach coordinator who also really pulled together this conference, Rama Levy. And let's hear it for Rama. Having such a great turnout on Friday evening, the night before the conference, is not an easy task. And I want us to also give it up for all US campaign staff because they do an amazing job. So let's do so I want to ask you to just say a few words before giving the floor over to Hatem and Phyllis. And I haven't known her long, but I tend to do what she asks me to do. So, our conference actually today begins on an auspicious day. It's the International Day of Peace. And that was established by the United Nations General Assembly in 1981 because the opening session of the United Nations is today, actually. And, you know, they had the International Day of Peace to mark that. But for all of us activists, we know that justice is the road to peace. And that's why we do the work we do. There really is no peace without justice. Now, last year at the US Campaign Conference, we were celebrating the fact that the discourse had begun to change, and all the work that we've done over the years in terms of education and outreach had begun to make a difference. And that's true. That's very true. And we saw it. We saw one example of it at the Democratic Convention recently, when there was seemed like a majority of delegates were very unhappy about reinserting language about Jerusalem, you know, being Israel's and the party platform. But I think this year we face some new tough challenges because our narrative about the need to change US policy to support Palestinian rights, and particularly the right to self-determination, equality, justice, and freedom, has been sidetracked by Israel's, and the United States anyway, has been sidetracked by Israel's relentless focus on preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Now, we've also seen the Arab uprisings over the last 2.5 years go from the uplifting and seemingly simple beginnings in Tunisia and Egypt and onto the bloody and heartbreaking fighting in Libya and Syria. And of course, Iraq is not at peace. And all through the Arab world, there's turmoil happening. So this has all created a lot of confusion and uncertainty in the United States amongst Americans about America's role what America's role is and should be. And we're lucky, very lucky, that we have tonight with us Hampton and Phyllis, two extremely experienced speakers and writers and thinkers of these issues for a long time. They're going to work us through these developments and how we can position our US campaign coalition to continue the great work it's been doing for 11 years now, or 12, 11 years, to, among other things, get the US to end military aid to Israel and to grow the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in the country, and of course, always education, education, education. Before I turn over the floor to Hampton and Phyllis, I want to underline the importance of really listening to Palestinian perspectives on what is going on and bringing these perspectives into the discourse in the United States. And that's one thing that Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network that I co-founded, was that we established that to do, to bring Palestinians together from all over the world, to bridge our geographical divides, and to put our heads together and try and think of strategies and policies on how we get out of this mess that we're in and how to put a Palestinian policy voice on the map. I left a little flyer on most of the chairs in the room. Please do look at it. And please do join our email list and sign up for our Facebook and Twitter feed. And I'm really thrilled that several of the participants in the conference this weekend are actually members of Al-Shabaka's policy network. And that includes Hatham, and it includes Andrew Tati, who's just coming into this room with his coffee and other assorted sustenance. And it includes Rami Nasser, and Ahmad Hamdan, and I don't know if she's here yet, but Dina Omar also is a member of the network. And I'm really thrilled. And I also want to salute our tireless attorney, Barbara Harvey, for all the help she's given us pro bono. So do check out Al-Shabaka's policy briefs and commentaries on our websites at al-shabaka.s for sugar, HAPAKA.org. And like I said, join our email list, Facebook, and Twitter. So I'm going to start with Hampton, and then we'll go to Phyllis. They'll each speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll be able to have a question and answer session that I will moderate. And as I've been saying ever since Rama asked me to do this, it's always been my ambition to moderate for this. All right.
Assalamu alaikum. And good evening. And today is International Day of Peace. Please give 1 day for peace, 364 days for war. So that we still have a lot of work ahead of us. We have 365 days of peace internationally. I was asked to actually give a perspective on the Arab Spring and give a reflection on its impact or its connection to Palestine and the Palestinian struggle. And I think Felix is going to speak a little bit more on the U.S. policy and issues related to Palestine in the U.S. arena. Important as this, often we ask the question, why Palestine has been so central in the contemporary world discourses, and more importantly, why has it been so long in the Arab and Muslim world? Some in the Croats were proud would immediately point that it must be anti-Semitism in the Arab and Muslim world, or in some corners around the globe that have maintained this issue alive. However, I think we need to have a much better understanding of what had happened over the past 100 years, from the end of the First World War up to the present. In order to understand Palestine and its connection to the present Arab Spring, we have to actually look at the history of the Arab and Muslim world, because the Arab Spring today is a continuation of a process that has unfolded over many, many years. Palestine was, in the past, and still part of the colonial legacy, and is not separated from it. No one can begin to study Palestine and the Arab and Muslim world without understanding the colonial legacy. Indeed, the end of the colonial period in much of the world corresponded to and ushered in the beginning of the direct colonizing project in Palestine. This end of the colonization process can be traced to the World War I, that we saw the end of direct colonialism in European countries. And we had almost 40 to 50 years of actual people struggling in order to end direct colonialism, while at the same time, simultaneously, Palestine came under the direct control, direct project for colonization. In the Arab world, the end of direct colonialism ushered in the Arab world into the indirect colonialism in the economy and the political arena. The post-colonial or post-colonialism in general witnessed the removal of the colonial army, but the colonial structure was not, and by far was not removed, nor was it extricated. It is not merely the removal of the troops that end colonization. Education, economy, social and class structures are the constituent elements of the political system that was inherited by the post-colonial period. Political elites were all parts of the colonial project. Edward Said's work in this field is foundational and has offered considerable analysis of what took place in relation to the Arab world. When we think of the Nakba, we often think of its relations to Palestine only and the Palestinians, and not as part and parcel of the colonial and post-colonial process that unfolded in the Arab and Muslim world. Take, for example, the voice of consciousness of the Pakistani independence movement, the poet and thinker Iqbal Ahmed, who had more words and poems dedicated to Palestine and its colonization than at the time of the crisis in his own homeland. However, the British and the Zionist movement were worried about the support extended to the Palestinians by the people of the Indian subcontinent, including the Hindus, and none other than Mahatma Gandhi himself, who opposed the colonization of Palestine. At one conference in the Indian subcontinent in the early 1930s, the Indian population, in particular the Indian Muslims, apologized to the Palestinians that they had organized a conference that was attended by just a few people. Only 350,000 people attended the conference, and they apologized for that. In reality, the 1948 war brought about the change in the Arab world, and the Egyptian revolution in 1953, the Iraqi revolution, and the Arab and Muslim consciousness is directly linked to the loss of Palestine. How can we forget that Jamal Abdel Nasser was part of the Egyptian army that was embarrassed by the colonial structure in Egypt that put them out to fight a war without the appropriate preparation or without the appropriate weapons, and managed actually to cause them to lose. Then coming back to Cairo and actually carrying out the revolution against the king at the time and managing to make a transformation directly connected to the Palestine issue and to the Nakba. When we think also of Palestine and its history, we often also think of it in terms of its locality. When we trace the genealogy of Arab, Muslims, African, Asian, Central, and Latin American anti-colonial struggle, we find Palestine is centrally located, ever present and symbolic, and a touchstone for the contemporary unfolding re-attempts at asserting indigenous rights and an attempt at decolonization projects. You don't need to ask the South Africans about their struggle. That's why it was interesting when Nelson Mandela came to the United States. None other than Ted Koppel at the time wanted to ask him about his relation to Arafat or Castro. Nelson Mandela, being the leader he is, he says, "You don't tell us who are our friends." Meaning those who just arrived at the anti-apartheid struggle just a few hours ago are trying to teach the South Africans who their friends were during the height of the anti-apartheid struggle. What I need to say and what I must say is that the Palestinian struggle should not and cannot be understood outside of the confines of the colonial, post-colonial, and decolonizing history. For to do otherwise would be to sever Palestine and Palestinians from the global march of freedom, justice, and self-determination. Yes, we are refugees. Yes, we are occupied, and yes, we are divided. But none of these momentary circumstances lead us to conclude that the struggle is lost, or that the odds paraded by power are too great for hope to have much of a chance, especially if the drones that are monitoring the skies over the Arab and Muslim worlds are only the ones by which we measure the freedom, or the march of freedom, justice, and self-determination in the Arab and Muslim world. Palestine's march toward freedom has never been stronger. I firmly believe that justice will prevail, even after arrest. Now let me just take a detour in order to deal with the Arab Spring immediately. The Arab Spring did not only begin last February, even though that often we try to put issues in the immediate past. One has to look at the long struggle beginning with the Nakba, even before the Nakba, because the first uprising in Palestine in 1928 was joined by the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Libyans, the Iraqis, who participated in helping the Palestinians. Also, you can go through the 1936-39 Palestinian uprising, which likewise was supported by the broader Arab and Muslim world. But more importantly, we have to speak about the most recent past. We have to speak about the Camp David Agreement, which was an agreement that removed Egypt as a strategic piece of the puzzle from the Arab-Muslim confrontation with Israel as an occupying power. This was followed by the Oslo Agreement, and anyone that thinks the Oslo Agreement is anything but a security agreement, reverting back Israel to a colonial classical structure, where you turn the responsibility for security to the native population, and you govern from afar. Remind you that at the height of the British colonial legacy in the Indian subcontinent, England, Great Britain had no more than 40,000 troops. It administered the colonial structure by native forces, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and otherwise. Israel, from 1967 until the signing of the Oslo Agreement, wanted to create its own form of colonial structure, where it wanted to be in every neighborhood, in every street, in every corner, and wanted to have reports from every direction. By the first Intifada, that completely failed. And therefore, it sought to revert back to the classical form of colonial control, where you bring in the native population to have the traffic of independence, the traffic of control, the traffic of sovereignty, while it lacks none. The Oslo Agreement was a security agreement where the Palestinians would acquiesce to the presence of settlement, acquiesce for the control of their land, of their resources, without any sovereignty. What we say is that the Palestinians were asked to be half pregnant, meaning that you promise to be free but you're not free. You promise to have land but you have no land. You promise to have access but no access. You promise to drink water but only from a distance. The Oslo Agreement failure was and is centered on Israel's lack and refusal to recognize Palestinian sovereignty. Let me repeat. While the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist by the letter that was staged by Arafat, Israel up till today have not recognized the Palestinian sovereignty. They have not recognized the Palestinian state. They have not recognized the Palestinian right to the airspace. They have not recognized Palestinian right to their subterranean and the resources that are included thereof. And often we ask the question, why do you guys refuse to recognize Israel? And also the new argument, why do you fail to recognize Israel as a Jewish state? And I think the question should be posed the other way. Why do you continue to refuse to recognize the Palestinian right to sovereignty in their whole land? Why do you continue to build settlements? Why do you continue to demolish homes? Why do you continue to uproot the trees? Why do you continue to steal water? And why can't you allow us to fly in our own space and to breathe the air that is Palestinian? So we need to flip that question around and not be defensive about somebody that's already stole the land and occupied it and have the temerity to occupy their right to occupy it and not have the right or the legitimacy to resist. Now let's get closer a little bit more to the Arab uprising. The Arab uprising, once again, my theory is that it started much earlier than what we perceive it to be only 2 years old. In 2006, Israel unleashed its barrage and attack on Lebanon. and Lebanon was able to sustain the fifth most powerful army attack on Lebanon, and yet Israel failed to actually muster any type of damage on the Lebanese at the time, and they had to ask for a stop of the campaign. If anything, that broke the psychological barrier of the strength of Israel that it could dictate its terms on the Arab and Muslim world without any type of resistance. This was followed by the 2008 campaign on Gaza. And we have to say that Gaza withstood the attack that Israel had unleashed against it with the support of the United States, with the support of the Arab governments, not some Arab governments, including some of the major powers, including the Pharaoh himself in Egypt called Hosni Mubarak, who actually was pressuring the Palestinians to raise the white flag. And he would be ready to deliver the white flag from Cairo if they actually would have accepted the terms that he was putting forth. It's interesting that both Mubarak and Omar Suleiman were handling the negotiations between Palestinian factions. And more often than not, it was Omar Suleiman and Hosni Mubarak that were putting the pressure on the Palestinians to concede to U.S. and Israeli demands upon them. And after the Gaza campaign, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers helped the Egyptian and the Israelis to have a subterranean steel wall that was built in order to prevent the Palestinians from having access to basic livelihoods through the tunnels. Now, if you want a lesson in history, you should see and look at Hosni Mubarak sitting in a cage in court. If you want a lesson that history can teach those who oppress and can give us a symbol of their oppression, it's Hosni Mubarak who actually dug a steel wall under the ground to prevent the Palestinians from getting basic needs, and in a short period of time, he was in a cage for everybody to look at him. That is the value of the withstanding of Gaza and for being steadfast against oppression, against the attack that Israel mustered against him, with the support of Egypt and some other Arab countries who wanted the Palestinians to declare their surrender to Israel because of its might. At the end, we have to say that the Arab Spring was directly inspired by the Palestinians. That's why in the streets of Tunisia, we found the Palestinian flag. In the streets of Cairo, we find the Palestinian flag. In the streets of Libya, we found the Palestinian flag. And the Palestinian flag, we saw it in many places also as the U.S. was moving to its war on Iraq. We found the Palestinian flag here in the U.S. and across the world because it became the symbol for people seeking freedom, liberation, self-determination, and to assert that there is a different narrative of superpower. There's superpower of the people that is being confronted with the superpower of might and power of the 1% versus the 99%. The world population, including the Palestinians, have to be recognized as part of the global 99%, while Hosni Mubarak, Zayn al-Abidin, Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad, George Bush, and others represent that 1% that continues to think that through power and might, through economy and manipulation, they could maintain the world that they want in the way that they want it, and without any distinction and without any reference to people's desires for freedom or people's desires for self-determination. Now let me shift right now to speak about the changes in the strategic map. Israel for a long period of time had attempted to try to secure its borders from any type of threat. That's why it wanted to remove the Palestinians from its borders. That's why it had launched a campaign against the Palestinians in Lebanon in the 80s. And secured peace treaties with Egypt, with Jordan, and was moving to try to actually have negotiations with Syria to secure its border, while at the same time wanting to continuously put pressure on Hezbollah in Lebanon. That strategy was based on trying to secure the heartland through either peace process or utter use of force against Arab resistance or quote-unquote rejection. In the periphery, Israel wanted to have a combination of relations with countries and states like Turkey or the sub-Saharan African states that would help her or enable Israel to actually have a periphery strategy of its foreign policy. Egypt was a key state in actually forwarding this heartland strategy, and Turkey also was a key state in this periphery strategy as well as Iran. With the 1979 revolution, that periphery strategy collapsed in the Iran front, with Turkey, over the past few years, shifting its mode from wanting to enter into the European Union while constantly being rejected by the European Union, with France under Sarkozy being the most vehement in its opposition to Turkey entry into the European Union. Turkey has actually reoriented its foreign policy to the Middle East and to the Asian republics. It's not surprising that Turkey chose to actually have a forward-looking policy vis-à-vis Israel because it wanted to challenge both the Israelis and the United States policy in the region. Many of you possibly would not remember, but one of the most important decisions that the Turkish government have undertaken, it was at the time when they refused to allow the United States to use their own territory to invade Iraq, and also refused to allow the United States Air Force to use its airspace for the war in Iraq. That is one of the most important sovereign decisions for the Turkish parliament and for the Turkish government to have undertaken, considering that Turkey was a member of NATO and have helped the United States by sending troops to actually fight with the US in the Korean War. That shift has actually been steadily moving in the direction where the integration to the Arab and Muslim world and also to the Soviet republics that have emboldened and empowered Turkey to be the most self-assertive in the region. Interestingly, now there is a discussion between the Turkish and Egyptian alliance being put forth in the region, that if it comes into fruition, I think would be a considerable challenge for Israel, for the United States, and its policy in the region. Second, let me speak more on Egypt and what it means right now for Egypt post the election of President Mohamed Morsi. Now, if you monitor the election of Mohamed Morsi and you saw how he was inaugurated, it was just put an insult to the term inauguration. He actually was just left to his office, say, here's your office, no messenger whatsoever for the actual president, who was the first elected president post the revolution in Egypt. What we had is the military wanted to still play the role of being the US agent on the scene, and that's how the Egyptian military, we purchased their allegiance by $1.5 billion, which actually we paid the military, but essentially we pay our own companies, because any country that we give foreign aid to must use the money to buy US weapons and engage US companies. So it's another way for the 1% that give corporate welfare, right? Because we're always being used by 47 on data from the government. We have the 1% that just like they're taking all the time. That's most recently $775 billion, and nobody actually accuses them of takers. I guess, if you want part of the 1%, it's your right to take. Right? You're born with a blue blood. You don't even have, it's not part of taking, you own it. But in essence, the Egyptian military still wanted to play the role of decision making for post-revolutionary period. And I think part of the dynamics that we're seeing in these protests and the attack that took place on Gaza, there was today an attack on Gaza, that was part of the military wanted to play the dirty job in there to actually signal to the United States that if you don't play with us and go along with us, what you will face, most likely you will face these crazies. And because during the revolution, none of the protesters were able to make it to the US Embassy. And long and behold, when the President Mohamed Morsi is actually touring Europe and was touring the Middle East, getting some investments from Saudi Arabia, from other countries, that all of a sudden a few thousand people, actually less than 2,000 people, made it to the embassy and able to climb the walls and turn up the US flag. Essentially, it's the Interior Ministry, the security apparatus, the military wanted to embarrass the president, and also give signal to the United States that these are the possibilities. If you go and allow the Islamists to rule, that's what you're going to face in this aspect that will be unleashed. So still the military wants to play the determining role in shaping the Egyptian political process moving forward, and part of this process is to continue pressuring the Palestinians to concede to the Israeli, American, and some of the Gulf states perspective of how the Middle East should be managed, where Iran is the strategic threat, not the Israeli occupation that has continued to preoccupy the Palestinians, and that's where you see the shift in relations to Iran. I'm going to speak finally about Iran for a few minutes because you cannot deal with the post-revolutionary era without dealing with Iran. Let me say, Iran does not constitute a strategic threat to the United States. Anyone that thinks this, they need to have a mental examination, and we will actually operate for free if they want to do that. Iran does not constitute a strategic threat to the United States. The United States had 15,000 nuclear warheads directed at us from the Second World War all the way up to the end of the Cold War, and yet we were able to contain the Soviet Union, and we understood the validity or viability of man to assure destruction. Right? And therefore, Iran, with one nuclear weapon, without any intercontinental missiles, does not constitute a threat to the United States. Unless, you're Dick Cheney, where you actually Iraq would constitute a threat, and maybe from earlier Grenada also constitute a threat to the United States. So there are some people in our country, right, that think that people are coming from the south that are getting invaders, but never from the northern Canada. So Iran does not constitute a strategic threat to the United States. Iran does constitute a possibility of strategic parity with Israel, something that is fundamentally run counter to its own design for being a region hegemon, and it would actually undermine or undercut Israel's ability to have freedom of operation in the region. Israel, in its strategic design for the region, wants to have total freedom of operations across many sectors, including possibly as far as northern Iraq, and therefore a nuclear warhead or nuclear weapon in Iran would make it impossible for Israel to have the freedom of operation that it wants to pursue across the Middle East. Furthermore, both the United States and the Europeans are committed to maintaining Israel's qualitative edge militarily. The United States and the Europeans are committed to maintaining Israel's qualitative edge militarily, and therefore a nuclear Iran would bring this to an end because it would actually change the dynamics and when we have disparity between Israel and Iran across the Middle East. That's why the Israeli foreign policy apparatus, including Netanyahu, who's going around the country trying to drumbeat the drums of war, and there's enough neocons in this country that are listening to him. And Mitt Romney possibly less to him, and Bolton, who was on his national security advising team, they would have attacked Iran yesterday. But we have to say that it is not in the U.S. best interest to attack Iran, and it's not the U.S. best interest to continue to be the protector of Israel, and anytime that Israel declares somebody to be a threat to it, the United States is to act in haste to do so. Now, what we possibly would see is this continued pressure to try to get an attack on Iran, either by Israel or by the United States. In my estimation, that the U.S. military is not interested at this time to have an attack on Iran, because it entangles U.S. forces further in Iraq, which is still in a state of instability, and possibly also would undermine the U.S. attempt to withdraw from Afghanistan by 2014. And therefore, if there is an appetite for an attack, it's only in Israel, and it can only come if some combination of Arab countries would allow Israel to do it with them, without the United States, but I think all that is off if that takes place. I know that my time is a lot to run, but let me conclude with the following. Palestine issue is paramount and is strategically linked both to the Arab world, Muslim world, and probably to the United States policy. And I think those will deal with this and discuss it more specifically than I will at this time. For us here in the United States, we have to devote our effort in our work for Palestine. The PDS campaign is on us. There's no way to roll back and go back on the PDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction. It's a fundamental strategy that we have to undertake. And similar to what we did in the South Africa anti-apartheid, it's going to be a long process, but victory is within hand, and victory will be achieved. We have to be patient, be persistent, and be systematic in our approach. Second, we have to encourage the work on college campuses. We have a campaign against college campuses, especially Students for Justice in Palestine nationally. And we need to also double our effort to make sure that the Students for Justice in Palestine, activists for Palestine on college campuses, getting the support, both the legal support, financial support, the infrastructural support for them to withstand the campaign that is being directed at them, the legal warfare that is being directed at them, whether it's in Berkeley, UC Irvine, Rutgers, and other colleges, whether it's an attempt to shut down the ability of students to speak on Palestine. And I think while we are seeing the threat, I think it's important when your opposition think that your mouth is the most important weapon you have. That tells you that you have won the argument, and now it's only a matter of time. And therefore, I'm confident that our ability to speak truth to power has been registered, and we just have to double our effort to make sure that the change that we're seeking and hoping will materialize. Thank you.
Thank you, Hatem. This was a great sort of introduction overview to some of the considerations for tonight. Thank you all for being here tonight. I was a little worried that not everybody would get here in time for the Friday night session. And now we actually need more chairs. All you guys in the back, there's some seats up front. You really can sit in the front row. There's not going to be a quiz afterwards. You know, I know everybody hates that because they think we're going to like give you a test, and we're not. We might, but for the moment. So I was going to talk a little bit tonight about what the changes going on in the region, the Arab Spring, the current turmoil, mean for our work on challenging U.S. policy towards Palestine and Israel, moving away from a policy that is grounded in supporting occupation, endorsing and enabling apartheid, and moving instead towards a policy that is based on equality for all, human rights, and international law. Small task, right? We should be able to finish by tomorrow. And then we can all take a vacation. We're looking at a scenario in which the world is moving towards this new multipolar reality. U.S. power in the world is diminishing rapidly, except in one arena, and that's the military. The military strategic part, the U.S. is still the unchallengeable superpower. And that plays a very big role, even as U.S. economic power, U.S. diplomatic influence, U.S. cultural, and all the other political influence, in all those ways, the U.S. is a diminishing empire. But because its military capacity remains unchallenged, despite the effort to cut the military budget, we still spend 58 cents out of every dollar available in tax money for the military, for the Pentagon, for nuclear weapons, for the whole range of military things. That means, among other things, that when you have one really strong component, in this case for U.S. policymakers, their strongest component is the military, it means they rely on the military a lot more than they rely on the things that are diminishing in power. Diplomacy, for instance, negotiations, for instance, international institutions, for instance. So the wars continue. The U.S. is still contending for power in the region. And if we look at Syria, just very briefly, I'm not going to go into that tonight, we don't really have time, but one of the things we're seeing there is at least 5 separate wars being fought in Syria, only one of which is the uprising of Syrian people against a terrible dictatorship. There's a sectarian war, there's a regional war, there's a global war pitting the U.S. against Russia. There's the war of the U.S. and Israel against Iran. And all of those wars are being fought to the last Syrian. So we see this use of the uprisings of the Arab Spring to be pulled into these other global conflicts that at root are still the same old conflicts of the colonial eras. They are conflicts over resources, whether it's oil or natural gas, or soon water. Whether it's conflicts over the expansion of power, who's going to have control over the narrow straits of that region? Who's going to control the airspace? Who's going to control the military bases? These are all the basic building blocks of wars that are continuing. And we're hearing now, there was an incredible couple of remarks from the State Department not too long ago. The State Department spokeswoman, Victoria Nuland, said, she was being asked about the situation in Libya, and she said, you will remember, we are not always consistent. You think? You know, I mean, but they're admitting it now. This is sort of a new thing. Her boss, Hillary Clinton, at the same time said, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't make sense in such a diverse region at such a fluid time. Yeah, really? I mean, this is something new that they're just discovering. So this is actually very interesting that they are emerging with these new understandings. The Arab Spring is a regional phenomenon, but with massively diverse national particularities. And in all of them, we're seeing this challenge between emerging opposition movements that are committed to nonviolence, and crucially, the part we don't hear as much about, committed to mass participation. And when decisions get made because of repression, because of government brutality and response, decisions sometimes get made to take up weapons. Now, I'm not going to say that people don't have the right to resist. And when they are oppressed militarily, people have the right to use military force. But the fact that the right exists doesn't mean, number one, that it's going to work, number two, that it's wise, and number three, that it has no consequences. One of the consequences of taking up military struggle is the loss of the mass character of the struggle. We saw that in Palestine. The difference between the first and the second Intifada. The first Intifada, it's not just that it was nonviolent, characterized by the children of the stones, but it was characterized by this massive mobilization across social categories, across gender, across what's the word for age differences? Generations. I'm getting Alzheimer's, speaking of generations. You know, across generations, in every way, between urban and rural people, the engagement was total. And it was as much a shakeup of Palestinian society as it was a challenge to the occupation. The second Intifada, that was characterized by armed actions much more, didn't include that kind of mass participation. It can't. It can't. And, you know, that's one of the things that we have to look at, because what we're seeing, as Hassan said, Palestine has given us examples of what the Arab Spring was going to bring us years later. So what does this mean in terms of the US policy and in terms of our work? For one thing, it means that Palestine has slipped off the mainstream agenda. You also maybe saw the piece in today's New York Times, a big piece about, in an effort to get itself back on the world's agenda, Palestine is once again going to move at the United Nations. This time it's going to be a little different. This time the effort is going to be to get status as a non-member state of the General Assembly, ignoring the Security Council. Now, there's a lot of value to that. It puts the issue of Palestine back on the diplomatic agenda, which is the one place it had slipped off. But let's not pretend that it has slipped off the world's agenda. The world is not determined by what's on the pages of the New York Times. It's not all about us. For the rest of the world, Palestine remains very central. Again, as we were hearing from Hampton, in the region and in the rest of the world, it's global civil society that has taken up the cause of Palestinian rights and the challenge to Israeli occupation and apartheid and denial of the right of return and denial of equality of Palestinians inside Israel in the BDS campaign. It's civil society in the US that has taken up the challenge to how the US enables the occupation, the apartheid, to go forward. So it hasn't slipped off the agenda of the world, it's only slipped off the agenda of governments, particularly Western governments. So what do we do about that? The Obama administration has largely abandoned its early commitment to make solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a primary effort, a major goal of this administration. Remember, the second day that after Obama had been sworn in, one of the first things he did was the appointment of former Senator George Mitchell as his special envoy. And we all thought that was great, because Mitchell had this reputation for being very independent, for not being a tool of the pro-Israeli lobbies in the US, for not looking for another job. You know, and he had experience in Ireland, the Good Friday negotiations, that led him to say, if you're serious about negotiations, you have to have everybody at the table. You can't exclude one group because you call them terrorists. If you're serious, not because you like them, you don't have to like them, you don't have to agree with them, but if you want it to work, they have to be at the table, because otherwise they're not going to have any accountability to it. So when we look at, for example, the fact of Syria being taken up by Iran. Should Iran be part of the negotiations over Syria? Well, of course they should. They're part of the problem. They're arming one of the factions. Should Saudi Arabia? Of course they should. They're part of the problem. They're arming another faction. You know, so if we're serious about making this work, everybody has to be at the table. When Senator Mitchell was appointed, we all thought maybe that was going to be an opening around Hamas coming to the table. It doesn't mean you have to change your position and say, oh, we like these guys. You don't have to have an opinion. You just have to recognize that they have support in the region that you're trying to deal with. And so if you want there to be a possible set of negotiations that are going to get somewhere, you damn well better have them at the table, because otherwise they're not going to support whatever comes out of the negotiations. It's the ultimate in pragmatism. You know, we're the ones that get called ideologues all the time. We're the ultimate pragmatists. We want this to work. We want this to really work, and that's the only way you can do it, is to have everybody at the table, to go back to diplomacy and not to a military solution. So then we've had the abandonment by the Obama administration. We have a lot of kerfluffle around 2010. We were hearing a lot about settlements, but what we really had was a series of requests. Please stop building settlements. Answer, no. And then they stopped asking. You know, if it was real pressure, it would have been, stop building settlements, it's illegal. Answer, no. Answer back, okay, you're an independent country, you can do what you want. But you know that $4.1 billion we're giving you this year? You know the $30 billion we pledged over these 10 years? We're not doing that anymore. And you know how we support you at the United Nations so that no matter how many resolutions might get considered, or once in a while even get passed, you're never actually held accountable for war crimes? We're not going to do that anymore. That's what pressure looks like. And no, we didn't see any pressure. And after 2010, we stopped seeing even the discussion about it. So what do? We look back at changing public opinion. Now, in our country, our democracy is so flawed that public opinion isn't enough. But it's a necessary precondition. Without changing public opinion, we can't change the policy. That's what we have to do first, and we have made incredible strides. We're seeing it in the way the press is covering these issues. The fact, the front page of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, a mention in the middle of the article by David Sanger about Israel's nuclear weapons, just as a matter of course, as if we talk about it all the time. Excuse me? I thought we're not allowed to talk about Israel's nuclear arsenal. Suddenly there it is in the New York Times, as if it was normal. And you know what? The sky didn't fall. You know, this is changing because of the work that we are doing, because of the work of the almost 400 member groups of the U.S. campaign, because of the work of so many others around the country, people in this room, give yourselves a hand. I mean, for what we have made possible in this. So really, this is important, because it's not only about us either, it's not just the U.S. campaign, but we have been at the center of saying, you've got to change the discourse on this stuff. And here's how you do it. Education, 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 and challenging. We're protesting. We're going to Congress. We're doing all the work that has to be done, challenging the corporations, challenging the Congress, challenging the White House. And you know, we have, where I work at the Institute for Policy Studies, we talk about having an inside-outside strategy. We think that social change happens because of social movements. We build movements. Just like the U.S. campaign is part of a movement, BDS is being taken up by a global movement. But we also need to work inside. We don't usually have access. When we do, it's a little bit, but we take advantage of it. You have to work inside and outside to make that happen. So when we see what happened at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, when there were suddenly people who had said, no, we don't want to put in our platform that we should move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, because that's a violation of international law. They didn't say it was an international law violation, but we know that it is. They just knew it's wrong. So we've got to get in there and find out who were those people. Who was writing the platform that day that said, no, we shouldn't do this, and made sure there was a vote. So yeah, we know at the end of the day, the old policies won out. But there's a hope in there somewhere. Somebody was raising that as a challenge, and that's never happened before. That's because of the work of people in this room. So Palestine slides off the diplomatic agenda. What do we do about that? Civil society takes the lead. Civil society becomes the critical actor in how we reclaim the centrality of Palestine in the context of the Arab Spring. The U.S. response to the Arab Spring is all about us. Just one little commercial here. For those of you who aren't already, I urge you to sign up to get my occasional newsletters. The one that just came out yesterday is titled, "It's Not All About Us." Because that's one of the lessons that we in this room can bring to other people in this country, that what happens in the Middle East isn't necessarily all about us. It often is responding to the consequences of our policies, because our policies are disastrous for people in the region. Our policies create wars. Our policies create repression. Our policies legitimate dictatorships. You know, when we keep hearing now from Obama, from Clinton, from Romney, from everybody, what they agree on is that the U.S. has made possible a new Middle East. Really? I thought people in the Middle East had a little bit to do with it. You know, so this is one of our challenges, is to challenge the notion that it's all about us. When we look at the question of Iran, this is one of the places where we're seeing one of the most direct effects of Palestine being off the agenda. Why? One of the reasons is because when there's a public debate in the U.S. about the existential danger Israel is facing because of Iran's nuclear threat, nobody is talking about pressuring Israel to end its occupation of the 67 lands. Nobody is talking about Israel's denial of the right of return. Nobody's talking about Israel's apartheid system inside Israel that discriminates so overtly against non-Jews inside Israel. So with that, we have to look at how do we reverse that. Part of it means focusing on, for our work, on the need to get back to diplomacy. Just like we need diplomacy on the question of Palestine, real diplomacy where everybody's at the table. We also need diplomacy to deal with the question of Iran so that we're not allowing the U.S. to use that as an excuse. Because look what Bibi Netanyahu has won from his year-long campaign to unseat Barack Obama. He hasn't won the ability to unseat Barack Obama. Right now, Obama is way ahead in the polls, for whatever that means. But what it does mean is that he has had a year with the U.S. saying zip about his policy of settlement, which is a direct conflict with the official U.S. policy. Official U.S. policy is still that settlements are either, depending on the moment, either illegal or an obstacle to peace, either one of which they challenge U.S. policy. They go against U.S. policy. So we're hearing today from who? John Kerry, a call that maybe we should be considering cutting aid to the countries that are going through the turmoil of the last week. Particularly, maybe we should think about cutting aid to Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, or at least, he says, maybe make that aid at least partially contingent on their abiding by what we ask them to do. Really, we don't want them to violate our policies while we are funding them. Reasonable enough. Let's apply that one to the $4.1 billion we give to Israel and say, we'll give you aid. I mean, given that it's the 23rd wealthiest country in the world, I'm not sure it exactly needs military or economic aid. But nonetheless, we'll give you aid, but we won't give you a dime as long as you are violating our policies, our laws, as well as international laws. Somebody might mention that. But, you know, this is an opportunity for us. It's not an easy one. When we know that what has not changed on the policy, with all of this massive change in discourse, and I'm not going to go through the examples. Many of you, I know I've been in your towns, I've been speaking a lot on this, and I know you've heard me do it ad nauseum, and I'm not going to do it again. But you know the degree to which we have succeeded in changing this discourse. We know how AIPAC can no longer claim to bring votes to the table. They still have money, but they no longer can bring the votes. they no longer can even claim to represent the Jewish community. They never really did represent it, but they got away with it in a way that they can't anymore. The changes have been massive on the discourse. The changes have not been massive on the policy. That's our new challenge. We face the same challenge around building a movement against war in Iraq. Within a few years, we had built a movement where a majority, 68% of the American people who had long supported that war, were suddenly saying, this war is not worth fighting. We have public opinion on our side. It's now 78%. But we haven't changed the policy yet. That's partly about the problems of our democracy, why our democracy is so flawed. When you have a presidential candidate talking about kicking it down the field, we know we have a lot of work to do. So let me just end with this question of how do we reclaim the centrality of Palestine in our work? I don't think it means that we don't have to further divide our work, that we don't have to respond to the U.S. responses to the Arab Spring, the U.S. effort to militarize on its own terms by seizing those indigenous movements and making them a tool of U.S. policy and U.S. power in the region. That's the goal. If there is military support for the Syrian opposition, it will not be for the Syrian democratic movement. It will be for the other 4 wars that are being fought in Syria by outside powers. They will benefit, the people of Syria will not. We have to take up those struggles as well. And at the end of the day, the issue that is the most central for the region, for U.S. policy, for the U.S. economy, imagine what we could do with that $4.1 billion if it was brought home, means that we have to keep the issue of U.S. policy central to our work for Palestinian rights. It's changing U.S. policy that is going to make it possible for the Palestinians to reclaim their own movement for liberation and freedom. In whatever form that takes, it's not going to be us who determine that form. Our job is to stop the U.S., stop our government from preventing that rise to freedom of a new movement for Palestinian freedom and Palestinian rights and equal rights for all.
Well, thank you both, Harris and Phyllis, and thank you for being such a, I could see the concentration of the room, and it's great that everybody's so engaged. Before I open it to the floor, I want to recognize my co-founder of Ashiraka, Grace Saeed, at the back. I hadn't seen her before, so I think she came in when we were starting off. So, okay, the floor is yours. Let's take 5 questions at a time, and then we can turn it over to Harris and Phyllis to answer the questions. Now, I'm assuming that this microphone, I can lift it up, or yeah, okay. Who knows how to do a microphone? All right, who has a question? Yeah, you please come up to this microphone to ask the question so everybody can hear you. Yeah. Okay. Please, yeah, come on. I'm going to go over the table so we don't have to leave back and forth to the podium. So, sorry, could you say your name, and if you're with an organization, say the organization. So could we have the first 5 people line up, please? Thanks.
Thank you very much. This may surprise you. My name is James Stewart, and I'm actually on 97.1. And as maybe you guys know, it's a conservative station around here. I try to provide, I don't know what you would call what I would call my political perspective. I don't know what I call it. But anyway, I have a question. This is when I try to get through, I agree with what you say about Iran. They're not a strategic threat, and that's a canard. When we discuss the motivations they have for saying we can't let them have a nuclear weapon, what I get from the conservatives so consistently is the statement that Khomeini and Ahmadinejad at some point stated that they wanted to wipe Israel off the map, okay? And in reference to how the Palestinians see that statement, could one of you clarify where that came from, what's the actual truth about what that's about?
Next question. I think I saw a woman with a question over here on the left. No. Yeah. Anybody, please? Okay, go ahead.
I'm fairly new to this issue, so this may be kind of an elementary question, but I'm wondering, oh yes, my name is Mike Schatz, I'm from Wichita, Kansas. And I'm wondering, do you think that there'll be a marked difference in an Obama presidency or a Mitt Romney presidency in regards to our policy? Will the policy shift either way?
John Robert Williams, Scopy, Fiscal Relations Committee in Seattle. Fiscal Relations Committee for Israel Palestine. There appears to some of us that there is a gradual shift, barely discernible, but a shift among Palestinians, at least in the West Bank, from seeking a two-state solution to the older position they offered originally before the state of Israel was founded in that process for a binational state. If that were to occur in years to come, and we see it beginning to occur, will that require us to shift our own policy of what we're doing here in the United States?
My name is Rick Sharma. I'm a theological blogger. My firm is AAA Assurance. It's focused on the idea that peace is absolutely possible. I deal with that as a theological blogger. One of my blogs is a Quran Bible blog. As I speak to both Muslims and Christians, I often hear the same words: peace is not possible until Jesus comes back. As we spoke here, theology was really not mentioned. How important do you feel it is to deal with this from a theological perspective? That changes this issue completely from the South Africa situation, because the faiths are so strong pent up on this. How can we address the theological issues with this?
Yeah, my name is Jim Hamilton. I'm with Dialogue Magazine. You can see some copies of it back there. And also, it's the Fourth International. We are United States. We're affiliated with a socialist organizer in Algeria. We have a very large party, the Workers' Party. But since 1947, we've been for a single secular state in all of this area in former Palestine. And do you think that the call for a singular secular state for all that area, democratic state, everybody has a right to it, including the right of return for all the refugees, not simply in Palestine now, but all the Palestinians around the world? Is that a possibility? And I encourage people to, if you agree, the right of return and sign our petition back here. Thank you.
Okay, so while everybody is preparing their next round of questions, let's start with
The first question from, is it 97.1? FM or AM? Okay. If we listen to what Ahmadinejad says, right, he's always saying, if we are attacked, we would do this. So basically, it is not an unconditional sentence that he utters. And if Netanyahu is going out and saying, we need to beat him up, like if somebody goes in the neighborhood and say, I want to beat you up, they say, if you beat me up, we don't take the person who's saying, if you beat me up, I'm going to do this, you would take him to jail. So it's basically, we are having a bully who's going around wanting an attack to take place. The Israeli military is already practicing attacking a sovereign state which has not yet or have not attacked any other sovereign state. And this is not a defense of the Israeli, of the Iranian system. Israel have attacked Tunisia, a sovereign state, have attacked Iraq, a sovereign state, invaded Lebanon, a sovereign state, invaded Egypt, a sovereign state. Yet the state that has not invaded anyone is the one that we're saying we need to bounce on and attack them. And we take the translation, and I know that many of us here in the US don't speak Persian, and therefore all of it must, when he says something, it must be threatening. Right? It sounds threatening. Right? His sentences are conditional, and as such we need to be aware of this. Israel is in its own strategic interest that it wants to prevent Iran from achieving or attaining nuclear weapon. Now, it's within their own right to argue this strategic point, but not to make it that it is our strategic point. But therefore, we need to make a distinction that Israel's strategic threat is not the US strategic threat, they're not one and the same. And what Israel, Netanyahu, and the neocons, they want to make our strategic interest Israel's strategic interest and vice versa. And I think we need to be aware of that. Obama versus Romney, you know, if you think of the team around Romney, right, he has some of the, you know, talking about Islamophobes, he has like Islamophobe galore in his team. Daniel Pipes, what's his name? Faris, what's his name? Walid Faris, right? He's on his team. John Bolton is on his team. So if you don't ask about the individual, ask about his friends, and the friends that he has already indicate for you that will be different. That's not celebrating Obama either, because Obama is also subject to the constraints of the political process in this country, where Congress and Senate basically is really, the influence of AIPAC on Congress and Senate is tremendous. You get 92 senators that would sign their name to a napkin, right, that AIPAC would write on it anything. And the last vote that we had in Congress in relation to supporting the new relationships, the strategic relationship, we had 2 congressmen voted no, 11 abstained, and then the rest just voted for. So that tells you the type of relationship. So Obama is not going to put his own domestic initiative out because it's a quid pro quo. You want to go and protest with the Palestinians, or you want your health care? Do you want your education bill, or do you want to go with the Palestinians and get a head start? You want to go and pray with the Muslims, or do you want to do? Politics is very shrewd, and that's why Obama domestically has not yet stepped foot on a mosque. Right? He visited a mosque in Malaysia and Turkey, but he has not stepped foot in a mosque in here because he understands the political landscape in this country. Right? So I'll let you answer the other question, then I'll come back to it.
That's fine. I would just have one other thing on the Iran question. That was a very famous remark that never happened. The term wiping off the map is not a term that's used in Persian, so it was deliberately mistranslated. I think what's more important, I mean, there has been very offensive language from Ahmadinejad and others, but particularly from Ahmadinejad. I think he deliberately tries to be very provocative. I think his language is anti-Semitic. I think the question is, what justifies threats of war against another country, and what justifies the creation of nuclear weapons, you know, that sort of thing. Israel is the sole nuclear power in the Middle East. It's the only one with a nuclear arsenal. And Iran doesn't have a nuclear arsenal. According to US intelligence, it not only doesn't have a nuclear weapon, it's not building a nuclear weapon, and has not made the decision about whether to build a nuclear weapon. So given all that, it's just really a misreading to sort of, there is a threat to Israel, as Hatem has said. The threat is the end of Israel's nuclear monopoly. It's not an existential threat. It's the threat of losing its nuclear monopoly. Now, on the question of the difference between Romney and Obama, I think that there's a lot of differences between Romney and Obama. And I think for anyone in this country, anyone who lives in this country, anyone who pays taxes in this country, anyone who votes in this country. That it's very important to look at all of those areas. I don't think that we can vote on a single issue basis. I know people, friends of mine in the peace movement, who say, I will never vote for Obama because he is a warmonger in Afghanistan. I don't disagree with that assessment, but I don't think we don't have the legitimate right, as it were, in this country to ignore what are the differences in other ways between candidates. Elections are not our turf. We don't get to choose the candidates. Our democracy isn't that good. We are choosing between representatives of other more powerful forces. And even when the differences are relatively small, they are incredibly important for people at the bottom of the social strata. The poorest people in this country, that bottom matters. So that, there's an old saying, if you're drowning and the water is up to your mouth, that last half inch to cover your nose is the difference between life and death. It's only half an inch, but it's life and death. So I think we have to, we can't afford to vote on the basis of any one issue. On the question of one state, there were two different questions really asking the same thing. It won't surprise you to know that I have an opinion about one state or two states. But I also have an even more important opinion about whether it's relevant. I'm a Jewish girl from California. My opinion really matters not at all about how many states I think there should be. I don't live there, right? I don't live there and I'm not going to live there. I go there, I spend a lot of time, I care about it, I have lots of friends, but I don't live there. So I don't get to say what the political arrangements need to be. My work, and I think part of the reason that the US campaign has been not only so successful at pulling in lots of very diverse organizations, but why we've survived for 11 years and are stronger than ever, why we now have almost 400 organizations, is precisely because we recognized from the beginning that that's not our call. Our call is to focus on US policy, and the issue is equal rights, human rights, international law. That's what we're fighting for. You could imagine that there could be equal rights, equality, and respect for human rights and international law in 2 states, in 1 state, in 3 states, 1 state, 2 state, red state, blue state. The question is equality and human rights. If you have that within both states, if you have a 2-state solution where you have all of the West Bank and all of Gaza and all of East Jerusalem, and you don't have land owned by settlers that have special privileges, you can imagine that there could be equality in that state, equality for everybody, and inside Israel, equality for everybody. No privileging of people because they're Jewish or discriminating against them because they're not, or vice versa. So you can imagine that. Now on the ground, I think most people these days believe that it's not possible anymore. The settlements are too big, too settled, and there's too many of them. 650,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. What are we talking about here? But again, our role is not to focus on that, and I would urge people not to make that the focus of our work in this country, to urge that people support 1 state rather than 2 states. What we should be supporting is a demand to change US policy, to stop supporting occupation and apartheid, and start supporting equality, the right of return, human rights, all international law. And then finally, on the theology question. I think it's a very interesting one, and I think it's not surprising on one level that many of our 400 organizations, am I allowed to say 400? I know it's actually only about 380, but it's really a legitimate roundup, right? To say almost 400. A large number of them are faith-based. Christian, Jewish, Muslim. I don't think we have any other faith-based faiths. I mean, there's a lot of faiths out there. I think we only have those 3 in there. And it's not surprising because this is the Holy Land for those who are believers in those 3 religions at least. For me, whatever one believes, I don't think God wrote real estate contracts. So I don't think that necessarily tells us very much about what has to happen. I know there's people who say that you know, the theology that my friend Don Wagner tries, and unfortunately hasn't succeeded yet. He really tries to help me learn how this works, and I haven't figured it all out yet. But I know there is a theological basis that essentially says that Christians need to support not only Israel as a state, but the Zionist project, because the necessity of ingathering Jews in one place, in the Holy Land, is the necessary precondition before the return of Christ. And I understand that that's a theological belief. I don't think in the real world of the 21st century, we can make political decisions about land and people and borders and rights based on that. So people's right to believe it is fundamental. The right to pray in Jerusalem should be something that is as easy as praying anywhere else, and we know it's not under Israeli occupation. This notion that Israel has somehow opened up Jerusalem when it wasn't open during the Jordanian period is nonsense, as anyone who's tried to go recently has found out. But I don't think that it's the basis for solving a political problem that shapes the politics of the rest of the world.
Thanks. Hazen, did you want to say something about the theological?
I think in the US and also in many parts of the world, theology plays an important role. And I don't think we can underestimate the mobilization that takes place around theology in this country. Just think of the enormous resources that are mobilized by the Christian coalition in this country, and the type of interpretation that goes around to try to support projects in Israel, getting people to visit Israel, engaging in all kinds of rationalization. And once again, it is connected to the second coming, right? And if you just go into the Sunday services, and sometimes I do tune to 700 Club just to be able to listen to some of the things that are there, and you could see the type of material that is put out there. And for me, it's also connected to the rising tide of Islamophobia, because it just, it's connected to seeing the Muslim world as part of the realm of Satan. And one time I was on the radio with a Christian broadcast, and basically the person told me, essentially, I'm part of the realm of Satan. I said, well, how come you're sitting with me on the same studio? Right? I know. So you have this, and I think we need to take account of it. But at the same time, we also need to delineate that religion has always been mobilized for imperial projects. Right? So we do see that our religion is successful if it's actually powerful, strong, and it has tanks and airplanes. And we think of Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, that they would come into Washington with tanks and F-16. And I always say that if Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses were in Washington, they would be protesting in front of the White House and sitting with the poor and would be distributing food with food, not bombs. There will not be part of the imperial concept of religion. And I think we need to critique the imperial concept of religion in a very systematic way. And even in our own society, the civil rights movement, when Martin Luther King was in jail, he was writing letters to all the priests and all the religious leadership that was not out in the street, that was not really taking the position that they should take. It's the silence of the majority. It's us that go along and play along and continue to think of religion in some imperial concept. And I think that is the challenge for us in dealing with theology, because it rationalizes for people to accept to steal somebody else's property and say that God actually told you to do so. Even though that God is not there issuing or signing the contract. Now, the question about the two-state or one state or any state whatsoever, it's not the state that you want, it's what type of state. Right? In South Africa, we had 5 independent states that were for Black South Africans, but these were not states whatsoever. These were fragments of the apartheid structure that was put in place. So even if we say it's 2 states, what type of 2 states? And I said that even if we have a Palestinian state in the West Bank, it will be a state that would have no trappings, none of the trappings of the state whatsoever. We might have a foreign exchange, we might have a stamp with a Arafat picture on it, and we might have a flag, like many flags these days made in China. So you have all these trappings, but no sovereignty whatsoever. So it's not that It's not whether it's two states or one double state. The second is the argument of the one state is actually accepting the reality. Basically, Israel have put facts on the ground, and therefore, since it's already sitting on top of us, so many are beginning to say, well, let's have one state. That still does not address the fundamental issue. Are we speaking of a post-Zionist state, or it would be a Zionist state without the Palestinians? The Palestinians would be third or fourth rate citizen in this one state. So those questions are very fundamental. And I would have to see all the details before I would say it's two states or one state. I have to see many of the specific, the right of return, all that before we actually think of the possibility of whatever solutions the Palestinians would accept before we would actually say one way or the other.
We have another 20 minutes, so if you would like to, great. Excellent. This is very gender balanced, now all the women are coming forward. Men stay seated. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Well, in the interest of gender balance, I'm going to ask two questions.
Could you give your name first? And make the questions relatively.
Yep, my name is Elizabeth Bashir, and I'm from Minnesota Great Falls. So my first question is, I've been hearing a lot about equality and things like ending apartheid, and especially from Hatem about colonization. But as I read the U.S. campaign's description of itself, it's a nationwide coalition of 385 organizations working to end U.S. support for Israel's illegal military occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. But I think more and more, all of us are taking the conversation to be much broader and including things that have been talked about today, like the right of return, and that are aligned with the PDS goals. And so I'm curious if there's been any conversation within U.S. campaign leadership about changing that frame that the name and byline uses to be more broad. And then my second question is maybe more of a comment because I haven't formulated it into a question yet, but I really appreciated the history of colonization that you gave, Hatem. And I think it's really important that we talk about the history of colonization of this land. And so I guess to turn that into a question, you know, who do you see or hear writing about the Palestinian solidarity movement aligning itself with indigenous decolonization movements in the U.S.? Thanks.
Thank you, please. I think we can probably raise this. See everybody bending over. My name is Gretchen Ike. I come from Wichita, Kansas, and I'm part of a group that formed this summer to study and educate our community on these issues. I also come out of the anti-apartheid movement, had long years working against apartheid. So I've seen many parallels, all have for a long time. My question really grows out of a couple of things that each of you said. One that reminding us that the Arab Spring and what happens next in the region is not really our choice, or in as much as we Americans tend to think that we have all the power to influence everything in the world. Just as with the fall of apartheid, we can play a role, but the real work is going to be coming on the ground. And then the second was a comment that you made about Turkey and Egypt and the role of the militaries in both of those countries. And you said that the Egyptian, if I heard you right, said the Egyptian military, with its close ties to U.S. money for military weapons and so etc., was reluctant to support the new leadership's more independent functioning, and that there was a possibility of Turkey and Egypt aligning with each other. I was in Turkey this summer and saw the fears that people have that the military still has a lot of power within Turkey, and even though there's been tremendous change. And I just wondering if you could expand on that. Talk a little bit more about what's going on the ground in these two countries.
Hi,
Hi, my name is Pamela Olson. I'm from New York, but I actually from Oklahoma, but I live in New York. I'm the author of a book called Palestine in Palestine, it's coming out in March. And I'm speaking at this conference with American State. And the question is, I'm curious if you guys have any ideas or thoughts about how to bring all this information more into the mainstream. In my experience, a lot of times when the overarching narrative is the Israelis are people kind of like us who are victims, and the Palestinians are inscrutable, foreign, irrational fundamentalists, then the facts just kind of bounce off that narrative, and they don't find anything. There's ways to kind of fit that into the narrative and just sort of maintain. So, yeah, thank you. I'm Susan Hopper, I'm St. Louis with the St. Louis Palestine Solidarity Committee. And I have more of a comment about that theology question. I just wanted to say that I know there are the 500 club or 700 club members club, and there are some very right-wing Christians who want to bring all the Christians and Jews together and have a populace or whatever. There are many Christians who are motivated solely by love and social justice for the Palestinians and for that area. And I just felt compelled to say that a little defensive, I guess. So there are other kinds of Christians out there.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Marie, and I'm a volunteer with International Women's Peace Service. And we do work, kind of like frontline work on the ground in Palestine, resisting the opposition forces, much like the Occupy movement is here. And I would just like to hear a little bit about how we can put the language of the Palestinian struggle into the Occupy movement here in the United States.
Great questions. Let me take on a couple of them, and then I'll turn it back over to Fatou. Maybe Marie's first, the question around Occupy. I think that goes back to one of the things that the U.S. campaign has been doing for 11 years now, which is the education part. I know during the period where the Occupy movement had the encampments as the main part of it, before the current iteration of that movement, which is in some ways even stronger than the earlier period. But in lots of places, we were doing lots of teach-ins at the encampments on all kinds of issues, right? I mean, in New York, in D.C., we did teach-ins on the war in Afghanistan, on Iran, and on Palestine. I know that in Iowa, they did some stuff on Palestine with the Occupy encampments as well. So I think it's a question, it's not about just seeing the individual activists who are identifying as part of the Occupy movement at any given moment, but realizing that the Occupy movement has opened up a new discourse in this country on the question of inequality. That's the great thing about the Occupy movement. It transformed and turned a discourse that was focused on this issue of the deficit into a debate on inequality. That's what it's achieved. And it's not necessarily going to be those same people at those same encampments that are going to continue that work. It's different sets of people that are taking up that struggle in a different way. But the question of inequality is now top of the agenda in the U.S. domestic discourse. And so for us who are working on the question of Palestine, Palestinian rights, international law, human rights, equality, it fits right into that discourse of inequality. So I think it's an incredible opportunity for us both to do the kind of bringing our information and analysis to that movement for more activists to take it up as their own, but also for us to use that gift that the Occupy movement has given to every other political progressive in this country to take up the question of inequality. Then coming back to Elizabeth's question at the beginning about the breadth of the U.S. campaign, it's a very important question. I would say two things. One is that we are in the middle, not in the middle, we're in the early stages of a long-range planning process within the steering committee and a broader group of people who have been involved with the campaign for quite some time, have taken up, led by Kevin Martin from the advisory board, who's the executive director of Peace Action nationally, who's helping us plan that out, and there will be discussion about that tomorrow at some length during our conversations here. Many of you have seen and participated, I think, in the survey that was very much a part of the early stages of that, looking at what kind of organizations are in the U.S. campaign coalition, how we're seeing the move into the next period, etc. I would say, though, that from the beginning, although we use the term occupation in the title, from the beginning, the call to action always was much broader. We didn't take up direct campaigns around the right of return until after 2004, which was the first time that it became a direct part of U.S. policy. Before then, the U.S., although it obviously facilitated every bit of Israeli oppression, the U.S. official policy had been silent on return. So we didn't take it up as a separate campaign. After 2004, when it became an official part where the U.S. expressly denied the right of return, we took up much more active. So there's lots of information on the website based from that period and on. The call to action from the beginning speaks of changing those U.S. policies that sustain Israel's 40-year occupation and denying equal rights for all. And equal rights was always inclusive of the right of return. On the question of linkage with indigenous rights organizations, I agree that's a very critical one that we've talked about a lot. One of our steering committee members for the last 2 years has been Judith LeBlanc, who's a Native American peace activist. She's from a small tribe in Oklahoma, now lives in New York. And she's done a lot of speaking in Native events around the country and indeed internationally. She did a long speaking tour in Australia, sponsored by indigenous organizations there on Palestine. Organizationally, it hasn't really gelled. We haven't had those ties. But there's been a lot of discussion about it, and it would be great if you have other ties to of which organizations are working these days, AIM chapters that may be re-emerging or others. That would be very useful. On the question of the mainstreaming the message, I think this is really a very crucial point. And we have organizations that are close partners of the U.S. campaign. Some are actually members of the U.S. campaign, and some are partners that we work with, like El Shabaka, like the IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, whose job is their sole goal, with a staff of 4 or 5. Andrew Kadi from our steering committee works for IMEU in his other life. That their work is in getting Palestinian voices into the mainstream media, and they have been enormously successful in it, in achieving that. So the shift in that, where you see Palestinian voices throughout the mainstream media these days, not always well represented, certainly not equally represented, but far more than ever before. And the rest goes back to our usual inside-outside strategies, where it means both pressuring mainstream institutions, mainstream media outlets, when they refuse to cover Palestinian voices and insist on such one-sided coverage, and working inside when it's possible with a particular journalist, a particular editor, a particular reporter, where we might have an in and be able to feed them some information that might appear, as well as building our alternative media. That's the other crucial part. And then finally, I'm going to leave to Hatem the main part of what's going on the ground in both Egypt and Turkey. But I would just say one thing about that I think is very important right now. As we see both those countries emerging as very powerful in both a regional and global context, the rise of the call from President Morsi, the Egyptian president, for this new 4-party talks on Syria is very, very important. They had their first meeting, the Saudis refused to show up, but the other 3, which is Egypt, Turkey, and Iran, did show up. It's a first step, and it's important not only because it, in my view, has one of the few optimistic possibilities of actually creating a diplomatic means of solving the problem in bringing the violence to a halt in Syria to allow some kind of negotiated process there. But it also takes away from the US the control of the diplomacy in the region. The fact that it would be based in the region, and particularly if the INSA countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, the powerhouses, the economic strength of the global South, are brought in as supporters of that process, it will encourage and strengthen even further, and further prevent the notion that only US diplomacy can work. And that goes directly to the question of how we view the possibility of other diplomatic options that are not led by the US in terms of diplomacy on Palestine.
Let me tackle first the question about theology. As you noticed, my intent was not to pick on the Christians. I said that I mentioned the three religions having imperial problem. So there are within the Muslim world, there are within the Christian world, and within the Jewish world, individuals that think of religion as an imperial construct. Now, because we're here in the US, there tends to be a 70 million population. Therefore, I just directed my attention to that, and I understand that it's considerable organizations, Christian denominations that have been working with Palestinians. For AMP, we work closely with the Sabir, voice of the Palestinian Christians, as well as those organizations that are working here in this country to forward the cause of justice and freedom for the Palestinians. Now, to take first the issue of the colonial discourse, and I think it's important for us to have a broader examinations of the issue, and I did talk about colonization in relation to the Arab and Muslim world, but we are witnessing a movement from post-colonial struggle to decolonial struggle. And there's a profound difference between post-colonialism to decolonial or decolonization struggle. And I think for us who are engaged at least in the discourse about it, we have a working group on the decolonization. There's actually a university that is about to open up in the Netherlands by some of the African thinkers that we're working together to try to formulate it. He's visiting with us at UC Berkeley right now to set up a decolonial university, which will be one of the first to be actually set up with that idea in mind. We have to notice that decolonial struggle has taken place in Latin America. The changes in Latin America are part and parcel of this process. And as we begin to evaluate and engage in Palestine, we need to look at these broader trends that are occurring. For me, there's a number of issues that we need to witness. One, that the economic underpinnings globally have shifted. As we know, I don't know if you've heard, we're broke, right? And Europe is broke, the exception of Germany. And the states that have surplus are what we used to think of the third world. China, right? And I also, there's a lot of people in the right wing that are calling about the Sino-Islamic alliance, right? That the Chinese and Muslims are getting together, and therefore we need to run and be scared. That's another way Islamophobia gets particularly rolled in with the fear of Chinese. We have a long history of Chinese Exclusionary Act, and the fear of the Chinese that is being rolled in. So you have China as a major power, financially, economically. Brazil, their economy is really developing. Green economy, almost 80% of their energy is renewable energy. And they also, in terms of their experience, they have a long history of having movement that we're looking at trying to create a sense of equality. I bring Turkey into the picture. They're having a high economic growth, 10 to 12%. They're in surplus. So the world is shifting on the economic picture. Information-wise, I think when we speak about the media and the technology, it's closing the media gap. And it's important for us to notice that beginning with the first Gulf War, for the first time, the information is produced in the South and consumed in the North. That's the impact of Al Jazeera. Even though that you had all kinds of demeaning language, when you saw CNN actually getting the feed of Al Jazeera and putting the CNN logo over it, that made me just laugh. Because essentially, for the first time, almost in a 200-year period, the information production has been developed put together in the south and is being consumed in the north, and the north is attempting to muzzle the information, struggles about information, knowledge, and ability to represent. So that's very significant and important to realize as part of a decolonial process that is occurring. It will take a long time, but we are witnessing that part unfold in front of us, and I think we need to be at least cognizant of it and see where we connect with these forces. Now, touching on the native indigenous population, I always say that we are all colonizers unless we admit our relationship to the indigenous population in this country. So for me as a Palestinian, I can't speak of Palestine without having constantly to be engaged with the indigenous population here. I work closely with the International Indian Treaty Council, with the Western Shoshone people, with the Don sisters in Nevada, because it's very important for us to make these connections real and to make these alliances real so people actually would be understanding that it's a global struggle, and that's why in the halls of the UN or other places, the Palestinians are always working with the indigenous population, whether it's in here or when we had Mexico, the Zapatistas in Mexico, we actually raised the funds for them to develop their radio station and to have their radio station and to provide them that information. It has to be real and it has to be touched. More importantly, when we organize in this country, I think we need to focus on the border, on the Mexican border, the walls that are being built on the border. That's part of the indigenous struggle. And we had a campaign for the wall in the West Bank and the wall in the Mexican border. It's interesting that the same company that is building the Israeli apartheid wall is involved in the Mexican border, and then raise the question why we're not building the wall on the Canadian border. That has to be a critique of the race matrix. During the war on terrorism, since the passing of the Patriot Act, 2.5 million Mexicans have been deported. And if you know The Clash of Civilization, the first book of Samuel Huntington, the second book was actually targeting the Mexican Americans, the Latinos as a threat to our culture. So in here, they use the Muslims, here speaking about Islamophobia, they use the Muslims as a patsy in order to actually target the Latino because they, at least the right wing and the Republicans, saw the dynamics of the shifting demographics of the population, and in order for them to begin to limit this, they began to target the Latinos, right? And Obama, but at least the right wing begins the policy, the Democrats don't have a back spine, and therefore they just let the Republicans go ahead and run shots with it, and therefore we need to begin to critique. So there have to be opportunities for us to do the work with the Latino population, with anti-immigrant campaigns and targets to speak about the war on the Mexican border, and to bring the issues to the forefront in these alliances, because those are real issues that are confronting us, and I think the DREAM Act and other acts like this has to be part and parcel of the Palestine work. Now, the Turkey-Egyptian alliance, today actually in Turkey they had a number of generals that have been sent to jail for 20 years because they were attempting to overthrow the elected government in Turkey. So even in Turkey, after so many years, almost 20 years of still attempt to end the role of the military, which is really was wedded for us from the hip. It continues to be wedded to us in one way or the other. Still in Turkey, they're struggling to extricate the military from being the guardian of the state, which essentially wanted to prevent democratization from taking place, or the people to have their own self-determination. That struggle will continue in Egypt. The revolution have won one, which is the ability to vote, but they have not yet extricated the cronies of Mubarak from the military, the cronies of Mubarak from the economy, all these elites that have stolen the treasury dry and have maintained the interest, our interest in place for 40 years. It's going to take at least that long just for us to get the state represented and stabilized within Egypt. It will be, the economy will be an important factor. The economy is an important factor. If they are unable to bring the economy forward with investment, with development, the election could be rolled back, and the military still controls about 40% of the economy. Now, the potential of an Egyptian-Turkish alliance is actually holding two of the most important historical, cultural, political, economic, social, religious centers in the Muslim world. The centrality of Egypt in cultural production in the Arab world is unmatched. You think of Hollywood, Egypt is the Hollywood of the Arab world, not only in terms of the band, but they actually are able to produce and influential because he knew how to mobilize the cultural production of Egypt at a critical point in order to bring forth his Arab nationalism program. So Egypt is very critical in terms of cultural production, intellectual production, the preeminent Azhar University in there that trains religiously across the world. So the significance of that even combines with Turkey, which is the last seat of Islamic governance, and has a rich heritage of 400, 500 years, with a very strong economy and rapidly expanding influence. That alliance, I think, if it comes forth, it would have considerable influence to play in the future. I know that when you say that, some people say, "Oh, that's scary," and I understand that's what's called deprogramming Islamophobia. When Muslims and dark people get together, you don't get scared, right? So when Europeans used to have a summit between Russia and the United States, they used to say it's a small summit. It's not. They don't represent 1/20 of the world population, but we didn't get scared. So I think we need to deprogram ourselves from thinking dark people, when they get together, we need to be scared about the eventuality of cooperation. They will have a circle where everybody can fit in, and I think we need to begin to get acquainted with that possibility and change our perspective on that. The last one is how we could make the Palestine language part of the Occupy movement. We engaged the Occupy movement. Actually, we went and did Jumu'ah prayers with the Occupy movement. So myself, I did a private prayer gathering right there in the Occupy. Imam Zaid went there and did so, because we did not see it as a separation, that us here and they're there. We felt that we're part and parcel of the movement, and that has to be represented. But we need to actually use the tools that are at our hands. For me, my classes, I have a Twitter on my classes. So my students, I have 180 students. Each one of them have to have a Twitter account. They have to tweet one time a week. They have to develop a website that, in teams of 4. So every semester they have to put 140 different websites out that represent history, culture, society, because I can't have $2, $3, $4, $5 million to counter the Islamophobia, to counter the 1%. But what I can do is mobilize the grassroots, mobilize our skill, our talent in order to do it, and that's what we need. The technology close the gap. That gap has to be closed, and we need to be dynamic in actually getting the information out. As soon as I started, I put that on Twitter, I put it on Facebook, and just get it out. That's how we get the information. You should be comforted. This week, Newsweek, how many people saw the front page of Newsweek? Muslim Rage. People just took that, the front, and they actually made it their own. They took on and they put out images, they put out messages that Newsweek was embarrassed for the actual cover that they put for Muslim Rage, and it just is a way where those who are on the bottom 99% show the 1% how you could turn your own message on you and begin to be a force for power. And I think that's the possibility, the ingenuity that the 99% goes from the bottom up, speaking truth to power, the liberal sciences. That's what it means. It means to be creative, because we're never going to have more money. We're never going to have the resources. We're not going to have the tanks or the F-16, but what we have is the ability to speak, and that's why speaking is so powerful.
Well, what a great start to the U.S. campaign conference, and thank you all for being here and listening. I think Rama has some announcements to make, but let's give our speakers another hand before
Thank you for our speakers, thank you for Nadia for moderating, and thank you all for making it out here. Just 2 seconds, logistical things. Tomorrow we'll be starting at 9 a.m. I know it's early, but we ended pretty early today, so you guys should be there on time. We'll have coffee starting around 8:30 if you want to join us then. If you haven't picked up your registration packets, go ahead and do so today. If you're part of a member group in good standing and want to pick up your ballots for steering committee elections, we also have those. See me at the front. And I think that's it for now. Have a good night, everyone.